Hello, it's Dr. Chris Miller, and I currently am employed at East Coweta High School, located in Sharpsburg, Georgia. In this lecture, we are going to discuss cell structure and organelles. This is an important concept in biology and one of the main fundamental aspects of cell biology. On this slide, you will see a collection of various terms and vocabulary that will help one learn and be aware of various organelles and cell structures. I will not read through this list at the moment. I will gladly go through each one as we continue on through the instruction. So, we're going to go ahead and go over some definitions. In the first one, we're going to talk about the cell membrane. This is also known as the plasma membrane. The cell's outer membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer in which proteins are embedded inside of them. We refer to this as the fluid mosaic model. What does a cell membrane do? Well, it separates the contents of the cell from its outside environment, as well as regulates what enters and exits the cell. It is important, as a high school biology student, to know what the structure of the cell membrane is. It is called the phospholipid bilayer because it's made up of phospholipids as well as two layers. A phospholipid it will contain a hydrophilic phosphate head, hydrophilic meaning water loving, and two hydrophobic lipid tails. Hydrophobic meaning water hating. When thrown in water, these phospholipids will arrange themselves in a bilayer where the hydrophilic heads will be facing towards the water and the hydrophobic lipid tails will be facing each other. This creates sort of a cell membrane. One we need to know about the cell membrane is that it is selectively permeable. Selective permeability is just a term or a property of the plasma membrane that allows it to control substances into and out of the cell. It is very consistent in what happens. As you can see, if you look at the blue molecules, they are easily able to pass from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And if you notice these orange molecules, they are a little bit bigger. They cannot fit through the cell membrane due to the size and maybe their charge. As we continue further, we'll see that there are, in fact, proteins that are embedded called channel proteins as well as carrier proteins, in which that will help these larger molecules pass through. So just know that the term selective permeability is it's selectively permeable. It only allows certain molecules through and others cannot pass. Homeostasis is the next term. Homeostasis is just the ability to regulate and maintain a constant state of internal equilibrium, regardless of what the external environment is doing. An example of this would be when you go outside and you begin to raise or increase your body temperature by exercising, the sweat glands start to secrete water and salt. This, in fact, causes evaporation of the water off of your skin, thus lowering your body temperature. The reverse of that would be when you go out into a cold environment and your body temperature decreases in temperature, you begin to shiver. One of the not considered an organelle, but the jelly-like substance or semi-fluid material that actually contains and houses the organelles in a cell is called the cytoplasm. This is an important area of the cell. As you can see, it's this jelly-like material. Not only is this able to support different organelles that are floating inside of the cytoplasm, but this is also the site of a glycolysis. Glycolysis is an important process that will create ATP or adenosine triphosphate. It causes and helps make energy for the cell. Next is the word prokaryote. Prokaryote is just an organism that contains cells but has no nucleus. No nucleus. Pro means no. In a minute, you'll see that eukaryote, eu means do. A prokaryote has a plasma membrane and cytoplasm. An example of this would be bacteria and cyanobacteria. The issue is that there's just a free floating DNA. It has ribosomes and other this really the only organelles that it has, ribosomes and DNA. And these things are free floating in the cytoplasm of the prokaryote. So no membrane bound organelles and no nucleus. The opposite of this is a eukaryote. And in the background here, you can see a large nucleus. Eu means do. Eu means do have a nucleus. These are organisms that contain cells with membrane bound organelles and contains a membrane bound nucleus. These are larger and more complex than a prokaryote. Next term we need to know is cilia. Singular, it would be pronounced cilium. These are going to be short hair like projections that function in cell movement. This creates currents to help move substances around. An example would be lung tissue. If you look on the left side here, you'll see some small, short hair like substances. These are called cilia. This is located inside of your lungs. So when trash and stuff gets inhaled, these things beat and flicker and push current and pushes up all of the trash outside where eventually you can expel it through your mouth. On the right side, these little hairs that you see on this paramecium are also known as cilia. They help in projection, short locomotion and can move other things towards it or away from it. In contrast, the term flagella is just a long tail like projection. Long tail like projection. So these things contain the longer tails, and these are for sure used in locomotion. An example of a human cell with flagella would be a human sperm cell. So once again, flagellas just long tail-like projections that whip their tails around and allows the cell move through watery type environments. Next important aspect of a cell is the nucleus, and of course, the cell we're speaking of is a eukaryotic cell. Nucleus is the control center. Okay, this contains something called the nucleolus, which is a site of ribosome synthesis that makes protein, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what is a nucleus? In fact, it's a membrane-bound organelle that contains DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, and also manages cell function. Eukaryotes. Zooming in on the nuclear area, nucleus, you will find the darker turn inside of that has a core in which is called the nucleolus. The nucleolus is important because this contains RNA, known as ribosomal RNA, and this is where ribosomes are produced. Once the ribosomes are produced in the nucleolus, they migrate out of the nucleus and then bind to something called the endoplasmic reticulum. So if you look at this, once we cord out the normal nucleus, inside you have the nucleolus. This creates ribosomes. Ribosomes are these little yellow dots that you see here, and they come out of these nuclear pores and stick to this organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum. So next we need to know, what is a ribosome. A very good scanning electron microscopic micrograph that you see here on the ribosome. What you really need to know is that it manufactures proteins. Okay, makes proteins. If you look at this, you can think of a ribosome. A rib, which is like a barbecue rib, is made up of meat, and meat is in fact a protein. So think of ribosome as ribosomes make meat or proteins. Once again, it's produced in the nucleolus. Here's an additional diagram on the bottom right showing you where, in fact, these ribosomes would reside. As mentioned earlier, once ribosomes are created by the nucleolus, they begin to migrate through the nuclear pores. Once they migrate through the nuclear pores, they touch on and bind to something called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. The reason it's called a rough endoplasmic reticulum is because the ribosomes create a sandpaper type texture. If you notice on the periphery of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, you have something called the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum is named smooth because it does not contain these ribosomes. Now, what does the function of each one of these things? Well, in all, the total sum of all of it, it's just a highly folded membrane system that creates protein and lipids. Lipids are also known as fat. So the rough ER, because it has ribosomes attached to it, these are where proteins are synthesized or made and packaged. In the smooth ER, because there is no ribosomes, they store these proteins that were just made and manufactures fats, lipids, and other hormones, which are also a form of lipid. Another organelle that's important is known as the Golgi apparatus or the Golgi body. The Golgi is named after a scientist who discovered the organelle. This is a flattened stack of tubular membranes that modify, sort, and package proteins into vesicles for transport to other organelles or outside of the cell. This would be like your Amazon truck driver or your Amazon facility. A customer would order a package, the product would be modified, sorted, and boxed up and getting put into a truck in order to be transported to the customer. The Golgi apparatus or Golgi body. It looks very similar when you look at the diagram here to the rough or smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So, how can you tell the difference? Well, the easiest way is that the Golgi body is going to be farther away from the nucleus than the endoplasmic reticulum, which sits right on the edge of the nucleus. So, if you're in doubt, look for the sandpaper type texture of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or just look at the distance away from the nucleus. That will determine if it's the Golgi apparatus or the endoplasmic reticulum. In this picture, this would be one thing that you would need to know no matter what. If you didn't learn anything else in high school biology, you should leave high school knowing that mitochondria is known as the powerhouse of the cell. Singular, it is known as a mitochondrion. This is the site of adenosine triphosphate or ATP production and cell respiration, which basically just means cell breathing. ATP is the energy currency of each of our cells and is required in order for us to continue to survive. The term lysosome is another organelle. Here's a good picture of it on the right. When I think of lysosome, I like to think of the cleaning material or the cleaning spray, Lysol. Lysol basically disinfects and cleans, and that's exactly what this organelle will do in the cell. This uses enzymes, which is a specialized protein that speeds up chemical reactions, and they digest and remove worn out organelles, food particles, and engulfed viruses or bacteria. This would be considered the scavenger of the cell. You could also look at it as maybe a custodian at a school that cleans up or uses Lysol if you wanted to relate it to a school. The custodian would be like the lysosome, where they keep everything clean and remove trash and other things in the facility. We've all heard of a cell wall, and a lot of times people like to get this and cell membrane mixed up, whereas cell wall is only present, okay, in plants and also in something called gram-positive bacteria, and also in fungus or fungi known as chitin. So if you look at this picture here, this is just a rigid or hard barrier that surrounds the outside of the cell membrane. The inner portion of this plant or onion's root cell would be the cell membrane that contains the phospholipid bilayer. The outside of that cell membrane contains the rigid peptidoglycan or cellulose in a plant, in this case, that creates a rigid structure that keeps the cell from being crushed as well as protects it from the elements. In a plant, you have something called a chloroplast. Some protozoans also contain chloroplasts. But when you think of chloroplasts, you should think of just plants. What is this? A chloroplast is just a double membraned organelle seen here that captures light energy and converts it into chemical energy through a process called photosynthesis. So when you're converting light energy and moving it and converting it into chemical energy, that is almost like a solar panel. Solar panel takes sunlight or light energy and converts it into electrical energy. This is chemical, not quite the same, but you can think of it in that way. So this is just a picture of a leaf, and you can look at all the little dots inside are these chloroplasts. Okay, the green color or the pigment that you see, or excuse me, the green color is made up of this pigment known as chlorophyll. Okay, so if you look at the structure of the chloroplast, you have the stroma, which is the space in between these flattened discs. And then you have these flattened discs known as the thylakoid membrane. So the thylakoids are the flattened discs, the stroma are the gaps in between. When I see the word vacuole, I like to think of vacuum. Vacuole is just a membrane bound vesicle for temporary storages of waste and food and other enzymes. These are found in both plants and animals. The thing that you can discover about a plant versus an animal is that a plant has a large central vacuole, not shown on this picture, but a big vacuole. That is an easy way to distinguish an animal versus a plant cell. When you think of vacuole, think of vacuum or vacuums up all the garbage and stores it in its little lake. It's almost like a holding pond in a neighborhood. We've just went over most of the cell membranes, or excuse me, of the cell organelles that you would most likely need to know. And as we continue on, I will go into the cell theory, which have three components, as well as some various other examples. So, cell theory. What you need to know about cell theory is that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. The second tenet is the cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. Finally, cells arise only from pre existing cells. Those are the three components of the cell theory. We also have many different types of cells. As we mentioned before, I had a prokaryote, and then I mentioned a eukaryote. A prokaryote does not have a nucleus. A eukaryote does have a nucleus. So the different groups, or excuse me, kingdoms of prokaryotic cells would be archaea and bacteria. And this is actually called the domains. There we have a three domain system of classification now: archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. You could probably imagine that in the kingdom eukarya, these are the components or the membranes of or the organisms that contain a nucleus. So these prokaryotic cells, archaea, if you look on the left side here, this is at Yellowstone National Park at the Grand Prismatic Spring, which is found in Wyoming, and it's a beautiful, interesting lake, like a natural spring that is hot. So it's a hot spring, and it contains these things called thermophiles. So if you look at the picture, you can see the multiple colors that arise from the way that these different bacteria react to the heat. Thermophiles just means that they love heat. These are forms of archaea. I like to think of the archaea domain as old, the older primitive prokaryotic cells. If you ever get a chance to go to Yellowstone, it's definitely cool to see and highly recommend it. On the right side here is this would be in the domain bacteria. Now, what you see here, this is known as Streptococcus pyogenes. This is the disease that causes strep throat, and this is a pathogen. So, any kid that gets strep throat, you have these long chains, which are called strepto. Strep means strip. Cocci means close, like grape looking or straight chain. So, Streptococcus pyogenes or strep throat bacteria is Latin for what you see here. This also contains no nucleus, but is very virulent and causes a lot of problems in young kids and young adults. In the domain Eukarya, you have four different kingdoms that we talk about: Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. So, a couple of these that I'll mention is this obviously would be an animal and contains many animal cells that contain all those organelles that we mentioned. Top right would be plant. Bottom right were these Basidiomycotes, Basidiomycote fungi. Right here are mushrooms. And on the left, what I'm looking at here is a blood smear, but I'm not really looking at the biconcave discs of the red blood cells. What I'm looking at here is the Trypanosoma cruzi microbes here. These are known as protists. This is a pathogen that actually causes something called Chagas disease in South America. It creates a large heart and is deadly if not treated. The only way you can really tell if people have this is by a blood smear. So that is a type of protist known as Trypanosoma cruzi. I'd like to thank you for listening to the lecture. This is Dr. Miller signing off.